Welcome to the Free Marketeers, the official podcast of the Free Market Foundation.
Hello listeners, thank you for joining us on the latest Free Marketeers podcast. You're joined by myself, Chris Hattingh, and Martin van Staden this week. Mpiaki Glamini is MIA, but we'll find him again next week, and I'm sure he'll come back with very controversial and strong opinions. This week I thought we'd start by doing a recap and just a proper whole body discussion on the matter of expropriation without compensation. Sort of a refresh for the both of us and for all of you listeners to see where the debate currently stands, what the issues are right now, the next moves forward. We know Parliament, the 5th Parliament is over, and then the next Parliament will begin after the 8th of May election, when all of the results and all that kind of thing comes out. So Martin, from the legal standpoint, where do things stand right now? Maybe the next moves in court, that kind of thing. We know that various civil organizations such as AfriForum, Helen Suzman, the RR, they've talked about court cases that they could bring once the matter is signed into law, all this sort of stuff. So just from that side, what can you tell the listeners?
Well, so currently with Parliament closed or dissolved for this term, everything is gonna only happen again after the election. So until the 8th of May, don't expect anything to happen, even though there has been some moaning and groaning from certain quarters that this isn't happening quick enough from those red beret wearing people. But yeah, so the next step would be probably that the expropriation bill will be passed probably early-ish in the next Parliament. I think it probably still needs to go to yes, it still needs to go through public participation in the National Assembly, then it needs to go to the National Council of Provinces, so there's still a process to follow. It would be weird if the amendment to the Constitution is done before the expropriation bill, because then they'll need to redo the expropriation bill, which would be very silly, because the expropriation bill is still written in the context of the current constitution, which does require compensation to be paid when property is expropriated. So I think it's probably going to be expropriation bill, and then months later or something, they will continue with the constitutional amendment, if they decide to continue with the constitutional amendment. So we have been thinking that if the expropriation bill gives them what they want, they may abandon the constitutional amendment. That is, I guess, a hope.
Right.
But I don't know if the government has promised too much that it can't really back down right now. So yeah, where we're currently at is that Parliament has adopted the Constitutional Review Committee's report. So in principle, Parliament is dedicated to expropriation without compensation, although one Parliament cannot bind its successor. So in theory, the next Parliament can say we're not bound by that. So that's also a possibility, although not a very likely one. Because I think we all know who is going to form the government and with who they're probably going to vote. So it's very, very unlikely. Yeah, so that's where we are legally. And one can only hope that I don't know, that President Ramaphosa gets his so-called mysterious mandate to be a moderate in this election, which I think we've always stated our doubts about that in this podcast.
I think it's a strong indication of desperation how people are trying to cast him in this role, where if he only had enough support, he would follow through with what they paint as his beliefs. Yeah. Where there's all the evidence to the contrary.
Yeah, he's never himself said, no, I oppose expropriation without compensation in principle. Like everything I've read about him and of him has seemed to indicate that he's pretty much in favor of this. And then as far as court cases go, so the articles that I've been writing and I've written already basically come down to one thing, is that it depends on the text of the amendment. Okay. So it is, I guess it's a 50-50. The amendment can either be what we've all been fearing, which is essentially a complete watering down of property rights. And in that respect, there will definitely be challenges in court based on... I think the other organizations that you've mentioned will probably do it on a technicality. So they've all been talking about the flawed public participation process. So they will say most South Africans in their submissions said we do not want expropriation without compensation. Yet your parliament goes ahead with amending the constitution. That's not correct. That's not public participation. And I think that's the basis on which they will challenge it.
Okay.
But the work I've been doing, and I hope some people have been paying attention, one can only hope, is that there should be a substantive challenge to expropriation without compensation. And that's on two bases, maybe three, but the two big ones. First one is, it's kind of technical, but there is some substantive analysis embedded in it, and that is that you need 75% of the National Assembly to amend it, which the ANC and the EFF and the pro-EWC parties probably won't get, although I'm not going to preempt the election. Any bad thing can happen. But if they don't get 75%, I think an argument can be made that they need 75% to divest South Africans of an established right. And then the other argument is the so-called basic structure argument, to say that you cannot do expropriation without compensation under any circumstances, because that violates the basic structure of the Constitution. And if you do it, you're basically replacing the Constitution with a new one. And Parliament does not have that power. And those will be the two substantive challenges to EWC that I will be looking out for.
Okay. Just on the public participation process, the FMF, for example, wasn't given an opportunity to present our opposition to expropriation without compensation. For the listeners and for people who maybe have written or want to now write and participate in the process more publicly, I don't know, maybe go on radio, that kind of thing. Do you think there will be another opportunity for public participation, or is it all now sort of within Parliament and within the powers of, the corridors of power?
Well, it's actually a very confused exercise. So in theory, there needs to be a whole new round of public participation the moment the Constitution Amendment Bill is proposed. So they'll put out the text, and then it needs to go through the National Council, through the National Assembly. They need to do hearings again, written submissions. Then National Council of Provinces, they need to do hearings and written submissions. And then, in theory, that is when it ends, and then the NA will pass it, and the NCOP will pass it, and the President will sign it, and then it becomes an amendment to the Constitution, and it becomes law in theory. So there is still a round of public participation that needs to go. So listeners, please, if you oppose EWC, as you absolutely need to and should, you should write articles, still try and influence the climate of public opinion, say that this is a disaster. At worst, it will lead to starvation. At best, it will lead to, I don't know, recession and these all bad things. Like, this cannot go anywhere good. So please still write articles, call into radio stations, write letters, and so forth.
Even if the wording of the amendment is our best, interpretation or our best hope, it's still the first step in this process of then we open the door to amending the Constitution as a rule. I think, and that we need to very much keep in mind, because this will be the first time in our democratic history that we do this sort of thing. And then I really think that, as I've mentioned before, tyranny, we think maybe it's a violent overthrow overnight kind of thing, but it comes in small steps. And this will be the first step in watering down property rights. It might sound okay for now, and they might do it in a way where it's palatable for investors and that sort of thing, but we're going to grant, in principle, government this power to seize our property. And that's why you need to fight it now. I mean, that doesn't mean if it does happen, or it probably will happen, but if it happens, then we pack our bags and we leave, for example. And we're still going to fight, and we're still going to do our best. But now, while the Constitution is still intact, I think you need to throw everything at it now.
Yeah, so this will be the first time that the Bill of Rights is amended. So the Constitution, I think, has been amended 17 times so far. Technical amendments, just changing words here and there and so forth. But this is the first time that the Bill of Rights, which itself is described in the Constitution as the cornerstone of democracy, when that is amended. Now the Constitution gives government the power to amend the Bill of Rights. So we can't say that this is itself a travesty in and of itself, but I think from at least our perspective as broadly liberal, individual rights orientated people, it's the start of a slippery slope, because the Bill of Rights does not grant anyone rights. It simply says South Africans have rights, and the Constitution, as the highest law, is going to seek to protect those rights. And the moment government starts saying, no, but okay, you do have property rights, but
Yes.
we're going to take away the protections
Yeah.
for that right.
Yeah.
That is the start of something I cannot in any way describe as good. It's a slippery slope. And then, as you say, if, as we hope, the amendment, if it is passed at all, is just like a watered down type of thing to make it just for the government to save face and just to carry on as
Right,
before.
like they're trying to do something, and
Yeah.
and okay, voters, you wanted this, so we're giving it to you.
Yeah. So, but that is going to already establish a principle, and then it means any radical future government, and actually I shouldn't call it radical, just more of the same, but in an extreme fashion, more tyranny in an extreme fashion. They're gonna say, yeah, but okay, so we're just finishing the process. They started something there. We accepted in principle back then that property rights are problematic to a prosperous society, and we want to prosper through communism or something. So we're just finishing the process. Why are you complaining?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, that is what this will do if the amendment is passed. And I mean, it doesn't stop at property rights. I mean, we're saying now that, okay, we're a democracy where rights can be watered down, protections for rights can be watered down.
Rights up for discussion and debate, and we'll keep the ones we like, and throw away the ones we don't like.
Yeah, and I mean, don't even just look at the Bill of Rights. If you look at the testing rights of the courts over government conduct and authority, it's section 160 something, I think, I can't remember. That is also just protected by a 2/3 majority requirement. So in theory, as we sit here today right now, government can amend the constitution and say the courts can no longer hold us accountable. Very easy, done and dusted. 66.3% of the vote. And if we do this, I think we in essence say that is going to be okay.
Yeah.
Because we're saying that the constitution is no longer, I don't want to say sacred, but like something that needs to be very carefully handled.
Yeah.
We've opened a box now where we're basically saying, no, we should just play with the constitution like clay and mangle it to our objective is our being the political class. I do not think that's good. I mean, in theory, the U.S. Constitution can also be very
right.
If you have a national consensus about something, you can edit it. you can amend
Copy
it,
paste and cut and delete.
Yes, but I think in America, which is always a country I look up to when it comes to constitutionalism, there's a very embedded respect for the integrity of the Constitution among the people, even people who don't really like what it says.
Right,
There's a level of respect and restraint. And they say, okay, let's really build the national consensus around it first before we even get to talking about an amendment. But in South Africa, even though you may say that, okay, a lot of people want expropriation without compensation, I don't think you can say there's a national consensus. Nothing close to it, because... firstly, the debate is so confused. The discourse is riddled with lies. We talk about the government essentially is selling expropriation without compensation in restitutionary rhetoric, basically saying property that was taken from people needs to be given back, and that is why we're doing expropriation without compensation. And we know this is a lie, because we already have a restitutionary process, and government is dedicating like 0.5% of the national budget to it. It doesn't care. It does not care about restitution. So it's using the rhetoric of restitution to justify what I think is redistribution. Basically just government coming in, taking property, handing it out to cronies or friends or whatever. And that's what this will enable them to do when in fact they're trying to convince ordinary South Africans who definitely are not as... I mean, not everyone is a constitutional expert. They do not understand necessarily what government is doing. They just like how it sounds. And I think most people around the world are like that when it comes to politics. So the discourse is riddled with lies. And this is what's going to form the basis of a constitutional amendment. So there's no national consensus.
Just on your point a bit earlier that you talked about sort of the power of government and what could happen maybe in the future. I just want to, maybe this is an emotional appeal to our ideological opponents, normally people on the left, to them especially. If you are ever worried about someone, maybe your worst nightmare as a leader, say Donald Trump, Donald Trump coming into power in South Africa one day, a right-wing conservative, if you want to couch it, capitalist leader comes into power in South Africa. If he and his party then have this power to seize your property as they see fit, then you're also in danger. This doesn't mean that just because post this election government will have this power, that they're always going to remain in power.
Exactly.
This now becomes open to any government in the future to abuse. That's why I think we're placing so much importance on not amending the constitution now, because it's in your own self-interest that your property rights are secure. If the government has this power, they can come in at any point, seize what they like, they can justify it under any guise, they can say it's for the common good, for the revolution, for redistribution, for I don't know, anything. It's then up to them to decide on the whim of the day. And I think it's very, very important to point out. And then just on sort of the national consensus, and you and I attended a sort of discussion conference yesterday at Sakaliga in Pretoria, where a whole bunch of different people attended, a whole bunch of different organizations were represented. I think there was very good discussion, stimulating debate, and points raised from the legal, philosophical, and practical viewpoints. Russell Lamberti, for example, was there. Many of you listeners, I'm sure you've heard of him and listened to him talk. But on the national consensus matter, we think that the debate is aimed towards redistributing white farms. But once the amendment is adopted, all property is up for grabs. So you need to remember as well, the majority of South Africans who are black, and a lot of them are poor, they're going to suffer the most from this, because investment is going to leave the country, and they're going to suffer from the low economic growth, as has happened throughout South Africa's history. Black South Africans suffer the most when property rights are thrown out the window. And now we're taking for granted what we've enjoyed since 1994. It's not perfect, and I don't think we should be very careful of thinking, oh, we've got democracy, therefore it's perfect, and everyone's going to get what they want, and you're going to live a perfect life. That's that's not the cost of freedom, but it's the responsibility of freedom. It's up to you then to live your life, and to figure out what works best for you. So just, remember, they might say that there's this hunger for land, and for a lot of people, it's very emotional, and you might tie in a lot of your personal meaning with the land that you own and where you live and your ancestors. But you're not going to be insecure in that if this amendment goes through. So you might then, sure, let's say it gets amended and then the government comes in, they spend more money on this land reform process now, and they actually give back land to people whose ancestors live there. It's not going to be yours. You're going to be a vassal of the state. They can take it away at any point. So please, especially to our opponents normally, just keep all of this in mind.
So even if it doesn't entrench this custodianship fallacy that the state is just a custodian, the fact that government can take the property from you without paying anything essentially means you no longer have property rights. Because I mean, if you don't, you do not get paid for the property, it means government does not recognize your ownership of it at any point in the future. So it's essentially a nullification of property rights in total. If that, I mean, there's still going to be due process, and the courts can still look that the process is fine. But I mean, I regard personally, and I think many people would agree, the requirement to pay compensation to be the biggest safeguard against arbitrary conduct by government in this regard. So without that, it's essentially gonna mean state ownership of all property in law, if not immediately in fact. Then the point you made about poor South Africans being the most worst affected. Now, a lot of our opponents are going to say, no, this is a lie, because before the colonialists came to South Africa, people lived under common property regimes. Now, the fact of the matter is that Section 25 does not just protect individual property rights. It recognizes very explicitly collective ownership and communal ownership and so forth, and it tells government to redress communities who have been deprived of their property rights. Now, property rights broadly defined, and this includes communal tenure. So even if you are someone who thinks South Africa is actually a socialist state, or whatever, in whatever perverse way, or a communitarian state where individuals should not own property rights, only the community should own it, this amendment is just as dangerous to that state of affairs than to individual property rights, because this is going to say it's not the community that in fact owns the property, it's going to be government. And I mean, if all South Africans currently have seen a government that they do not like, and that's the best point that you've made, that we've also tried to make here at the FMF, is that do not think short term about this. in 100 years, whatever, when your great-grandchildren are around, there may be a insane government like the one in Nigeria or in Uganda, which will just simply take away the protections for homosexuals and people with transgender people that are in the constitution and condemn them to death. I mean, that is very, very conceivable because South Africa is a very conservative society currently, and I don't really see it getting any more liberal. And I know a lot of our opponents are very much in favor of LGBT rights and so forth. So especially among the EFF, they're very strong on LGBT rights, and they want to legalize prostitution, all these good things. But all of that is placed in jeopardy if you start chipping away at the Bill of Rights and against property rights specifically. So we need to be careful. Wait for a national consensus. If people really if people really do not want property rights to be protected anymore, there needs to be a very broad-based agreement among South Africans, not among specific groups, but cutting across all lines. People should be saying, okay, maybe you have a point here, let's do it. But I think we'll need to have a referendum, maybe too, with very well-framed questions. Definitely do not leave it up to the government to frame the question. It's going to be very perverse. And then we'll see, okay, what do South Africans think.
Just on the topic of the seminar I mentioned, the Sakeliga one we attended yesterday, was there anything from any of the speakers that stood out to you, any of the topics that that really struck home for you that you wanted to tell the listeners about?
Sure. So I think that the big thing that I think all three of the speakers actually brought to light, which I'm inclined to agree with, but which may seem kind of in tension with the traditional individual rights paradigm, is that we really need community institutions to kind of provide a buffer between the individual and the state. It's in very developed Western democracies, I think you don't necessarily need it. I think in America, a lot of individuals just face up to the state and say, come at me, bro, and see what happens. But I think in less developed countries, you really need that buffer. So you need strong churches, you need strong organizations like the FMF, which can act on behalf of its members, of its associates, and so forth. You need strong schools, you need...
anything like sports clubs, community groups, when you gather in your street with with other people who live there, that kind of thing.
You need to know your neighbors, I think is a good way to sum that up. You need to know your neighbors. You need to have, a neighborhood watch, at least, is actually a very good thing in South Africa. Concerned citizen groups. Just you need to have that intermediary step between you and the state, so that when you hit troubled times, you shouldn't go to the SASSA office and say, give me a grant. You should ask your neighbors, listen, I'm having trouble, please help me. And then they can help you without you becoming dependent on the state. And in essence, then I don't know, I need to be careful with my words here, but essentially you become totally dependent on what the state does, and you will feel very obliged to go along with what the government does, lest you lose what they're giving you. And I mean, you're not to blame. The fact is that welfare and all these things, these relationships that are created between you and the state, are very, very problematic.
They have a certain binding characteristic.
Yes, so and then it's very difficult to exercise your citizenship in a substantive way, because how can you stand up to government and oppose what government is doing when your very life depends on the state? So we need these community institutions so that we ensure that we very and under only extreme circumstances need to depend on the state. In the first instance, we need to depend on our fellow man on a voluntary basis. And if that becomes entrenched, then things like expropriation, I think, become far less likely, because governments are usually very concerned about the civil society's strength against it. Now, I mean, I think a constitutional order wants civil society and government to basically be equally strong. We do not have that in South Africa. We have a very strong civil society, but it's not equally strong. I think in the US, you can probably say that civil society is stronger than the federal government with like the NRA and all these big organizations. So I think if we get to a point where our civil society is at least on par with government, then we won't really be worrying
Yeah.
about these tyrannies that government can exact upon us. And I think that's what I took away from the Sakeliga event.
Yeah, and that doesn't mean that one is necessarily in favor of civil society replacing the government and the government, using force in appropriate ways, sort of when someone is, when someone robs you or that kind of thing, you take them to court, etc., etc. But it's a very substantive way, I think, of looking at what a democracy can be.
Yeah.
There should be the sort of as a diffusion or devolution of democracy into different areas. It's not just a hierarchy vertically; it's also horizontal.
Yeah.
You need to. Yeah, it just provides more bulwarks against tyranny, I think. Then it becomes much more difficult for government and the state. Let's say the state, not this particular government, but any state, to then paint one group as against another group. You need to keep that in mind as well. And, it's obviously, of course, up to each individual with whom they identify, who they see as their community. Just because you're Afrikaans, you're not going to necessarily identify with Orania, as one example.
Yes.
So you always decide what your values are and what's more important to you. But I think I agree with you. Yeah, that was a very good part of the discussion, I thought, and one highlighted. I mean, we see the need for these sorts of things now. The government is failing in service delivery and all the stuff it's promised. But I mean, I guess that was inevitable. It was never going to do all of this stuff, but it's desperately trying to keep it going because it sees it as sort of a way of getting votes, that kind of thing. As long as you're dependent on government, they think they can take your vote for granted. They think they take your power away as an individual, as a citizen. And you need to take that power back. That's your right as a citizen, is to decide with whom you associate, whether you actually vote for a party or another one or this one. So yeah, I think I'm glad we got the opportunity to attend. I thought it was good.
Yeah.
And then just as a last point, you wrote an article this week. It was published on City Press today. Listeners, you can find it on our website next week if you'd like to read it, or on the City Press website. It's also available on our Facebook and Twitter accounts. The links are there. And Martin, you wrote on taxation, the SARS issue. There's been talk of a tax revolt recently. I think a lot of our listeners and people in general might be partial to such an idea. Will you just cover some of the points you raised in your article so the listeners are aware?
Yeah, so I did cover this extensively in my previous solo podcast, so you can have a look at that for more detail. But in essence, I mean, SARS this week started moaning and groaning about, oh my goodness, people that have no tax morality, or there's a lack of tax compliance, and now we're not reaching our target for tax collection. And the point I made was, well, yeah, duh. I mean, if the state is so corrupt, then I would add unashamedly corrupt, and it's clearly wanting to deprive us of our rights, of EWC, and I mean, a whole host of other insane things. Why the hell does the government think people will be like, oh, geez, this government is so bad, but let me make sure I pay the most taxes possible? Obviously, if you do not endear yourself to your taxpayers, they are going to do anything and everything that is legal within their legal power to make sure that you get as little money from them as possible, if only to stall you in your evil doings. So it's like, yes, this is obviously going to happen. You're retarding economic growth as a government. You're interfering in people's everyday lives. You're enforcing your ideology upon them. Of course, people are capital is fleeing this country. They're trying to just keep their money and their children's future safe, so they're getting out. And so don't come at South Africans and say, oh, but geez, tax morality. You need to be moral and pay your fair share. It's like, why should the onus be on them to fund your ludicrous plans? You should be, as government, you should justify firstly what you're doing in a very strict fashion. You should be like, this is the reasons why we're doing it. And these are objective reasons informed by evidence. This government does none of that. Not even close.
Sorry, a lot of people now with the protests in Alexandra this week, people like to point out to people protesting and say they're entitled, they think they deserve goods and services. Why are they burning shops and that kind of thing? Why are they blocking highways? But, on the government is entitled very much, I think. these people were promised certain things, now they're not getting them. So why, the anger should not be a surprise to me, but the government takes it very much for granted that we should pay even more and more taxes every year for whatever purposes they desire. We're in no way now advocating for not paying your taxes. We're saying government needs to justify and show clearly, like above board. It's a pure case of bookkeeping. If money is taken from one side, you need to balance it on the other side.
Yeah, so I mean, the thing that annoys me the most is like at every budget speech, like we already know it's coming, but then the Minister of Finance says, unfortunately, my fellow South Africans, you will need to tighten your belts now. And it's like, my goodness, we have tightened our belts so much over the last few years, we can't even breathe anymore. And government has not even started tightening its belts. I mean, earlier this year they said, they're going to lay off 30,000 civil servants, I think.
I don't think...
It's like, we have 3 million civil servants in this country. That is not tightening your belt. Tightening your belt is if you eliminate the Department of Sports, like not consolidate it or something else. You eliminate it. All those people need to go to the private sector and go and exercise their skills there. Department of Arts and Culture, that needs to go. Funding research at universities like humanities research, it needs to go. I'm not saying those things are unimportant.
No.
Do not misunderstand. I'm not saying it's unimportant. It's very important.
It's too important for it to be in the hands of government.
Yes, and our current context. We cannot ignore what is happening in South Africa. We have no economic growth. Our unemployment is just skyrocketing. I mean, heading towards 10 million and then some. We are not in a position to do this. And of course, the NHI, please stop talking or thinking or even, I don't know, dreaming about the NHI. It is unaffordable. Everyone knows it is unaffordable. Just stop. And we'll talk about it again like in 2130 or something, like when South Africa has recovered. But for now, we do not have the money to do this. And the more you want to pursue these vanity projects, the more people are going to be like, well, okay, cheers. We're leaving South Africa, or I'm going to do everything that is within my power to pay as little tax as possible. And I know what SARS is going to do next. They're going to start eliminating tax loopholes. They're going to start taking away deductions. They're probably going to say, we're no longer going to do refunds or something if we get it wrong. I mean, that is the absolute worst thing that SARS can do, because then you'll just, like the airports, there will be lines going out the front door. People will be like, we're out of here. This is just insane. And of course, we'll get no foreign investment except from foreign governments, which is not investment, ladies and gentlemen. That is just that's a loan with a string attached.
If you're worried about the World Bank and the IMF giving countries money with conditions, when other governments give you money, those come with seriously ironclad conditions.
Exactly. So I mean, what the only thing SARS can do that is reasonable, but which of course it won't do, is it needs to say, okay, listen, we accept that we're not reaching our targets. We cannot pay for this state. It is impossible. So send a letter to Treasury and say, listen, we're going to collect what we can, but what you guys need to do is reduce spending. You need to reduce spending significantly. You don't have to reduce the grants if you don't want to, but then you seriously need to start eliminating national departments. You need to start ending these state-owned enterprises that really serve no social welfare function. Get rid of it all. You need to, I don't know, cut salaries significantly. And I mean, yes, we know the unions are not going to like this, but at some stage, like, we'll need to take the pain of the protests and the rioting and just say, listen, act it out. It's fine. We'll arrest you. But we're doing this. We're cutting spending. We're cutting salaries. We're cutting jobs because this country is currently on the precipice of disaster. So yes, SARS is being very condescending towards South Africans by being like, oh, come, we need the money, my fellow South Africans. Please be moral. Give us some money. It's like, no, you don't even deserve what you're already getting. So don't dare ask us for more.
And I think on that hard dose of reality, and I think good medicine is, sometimes it's bitter and you don't want to take it, but your parents always tell you, well, if you want to get better, you're going to have to take it no matter how bad it tastes. But I think on that note, we'll end for this week. So thank you very much, listeners, for joining us. Martin, will you just remind everyone where they can find all of our content and find us on social media?
Yeah, sure. So please like and subscribe to this YouTube channel. It's at the big red button right under the video. Follow us on Twitter. That is at FMF South Africa, one word. And like us on Facebook. That is Free Market Foundation South Africa, or facebook.com/FMFSA. And of course, visit our website at www.freemarketfoundation.com.
Thank you for joining us this week, and we'll talk to you again next week. Cheers.